WTIC. I'm Todd Feinberg. You know that, but not everybody does. So I've got to say it once in a while. Follow me on Twitter, @ToddTalk, my Facebook page. Go to ToddTalk.com. ToddTalk.com brings you right there to Facebook. The subject of unions is something I talk a lot about on the radio. We talk a lot about on the radio, and with good reason, because unions are, to go back to Bernie Sanders, an election rigging scheme. They exist as a way to take power that should belong in the hands of the people and move it into the hands of the system riggers, that is, elected officials who want more power and want to find a way to hack the system of the people being in charge instead of them. So it takes a bunch of our power, hides it in the hands of special interest groups, and rigs the electoral system in a way that's damaging America, I think, beyond what most people have even in their wildest dreams considered. Joining us to talk about it is Dr. Mark Mix. He is president of the National Right to Work Committee, which I've never heard of, I have to admit. And I'm really excited that there is such a thing and that you're here to talk to us about it, Mark.
Yeah, Todd, thanks for the opportunity. And while I do cover Band-Aids of my 6 children, I'm not a doctor or PhD, but I did stay at a Holiday Inn the other night, so maybe that gives me qualifications.
Wait, so I have that wrong? There's no doctor?
There's no doctor. I'm just
Where did I get that
guy.
from? I'm sorry to elevate you to such dubious level.
Well, I'm glad that we got that straightened out. But I just an ordinary guy, came from a union household, grew up with a stepfather who was a 32-year member of the machinist union. My mom worked in a school cafeteria washing dishes. My brother right now is a 4th grade teacher in the New York school system. And prior to 2018, he was compelled to pay union dues and fees in order to teach his kids in the 4th grade classroom. So I probably came from the wrong side of the tracks to be talking about this topic. But to your point, Todd, this is an amazing policy privilege that union officials have been granted going all the way back to the 1930s that give them extraordinary power, not only over workers, but also taxpayers, and something is worthy of talking about.
Yeah, well, certainly in the state of Connecticut, I don't know if you're aware of our particular details, but it's a state that's been ravaged more than average by this cozy relationship between Democrats and unions, and you can see quite plainly that the what should be the post-war period, a remarkable 70 or 80 years of productivity that the world has never seen, where great wealth has been produced. We don't have access to that wealth. It's all been squandered, and we don't even have the things that I could have purchased as part of, we don't have great bridges and beautiful infrastructure and state-of-the-art trains going 200 miles an hour to New York City. We have plunder in its wake, debt that nobody can figure out how to pay, and that has dismantled our ability to function as a state. And they openly talk about the glory of unions.
Yeah, Todd, Connecticut's one of the great case studies. I shouldn't say great, it's a really poor case study when it comes to union power. And to your point in the introduction, it's kind of this vicious cycle. Union officials are allowed to take money from workers as a condition of getting or keeping a job. They turn that money around and spend it on politics. And then they sit across the table and negotiate with the very people that they got elected that give them more power to force more workers to pay union dues. It's a vicious cycle. And Connecticut's one of those states that's been hollowed out. I mean, you were a manufacturing giant. You were a leader in those post-World War II environment in manufacturing and production and innovation. And frankly, unfortunately, now the one thing you've got to claim is an extremely powerful government that's beholden to union officials that basically are the single voice when it comes to how you're going to spend taxpayer money in the state of Connecticut.
Is there a model that you have seen? I push this all the time. I talk in a way. I've been in Connecticut and on the station for 4 years. And I've been openly articulating what I've articulated to you as my viewpoint. And, when I was first starting in talk radio a long time ago, I was careful. I remember my father calling me up and saying, you can't talk like that about unions. You're going to get yourself in trouble. And now I speak freely about it, and I feel that people are starting to understand. And yet, politicians still stand up and kowtow openly to labor. A year ago, in the midst of huge financial crisis and concern about how COVID was going to play out for the state, the governor let go through an enormous pre-planned pay hike for union workers. And it was just stunning that there seemingly is no pushback. There is no alternate political force that makes them pay a price.
Yeah. Well, Todd, look, the first thing is you're spot on in your analysis. The difference between union officials and rank and file workers is growing wider and wider all the time. And we see that not only in election results, but we see it in the attitudes of ordinary rank and file workers across the country. Union officials like Randy Weingarten of the American Federation of Teachers and Richard Trumka of the AFL-CIO, these people are really socialists. They admit that openly. Mm-hmm. And when you think about a steel worker in Gary, Indiana, part of the United Steelworkers Union, when they're confronted with this kind of, these issues that union officials are championing that have nothing to do with the workplace, they start to get agitated about that. And your point is exactly spot on. I mean, it's the difference between union officials and rank and file is growing wider and wider all the time. And we should never concede, quote, labor to union officials because the chasm grows wider and wider in every political season. And you're seeing it in Connecticut for sure.
Well, in fact, for a long time, the government union partnership has dominated this rhetorical space. And they managed to equate working families and working people with being union members. So they made it this little club of coded language where you could get away with a lot as long as you were sucking up to unions. And hopefully we're pushing that now in another direction, and people are perceiving these rigged systems differently. Do you have evidence of that as the National Right to Work Committee? Can you tell us a little bit about what's going on around the country that might encourage us here in Connecticut?
Yeah, absolutely, Todd. We have passed 5 new right to work laws in the last 9 years. And let me just explain the simplicity of a right to work law. The 27 states that have adopted right to work basically state this as a matter of public policy. You have the right to join a union. You have the right to associate with a union. You have a right to give your entire paycheck to a union if you choose to do so. But in the right to work states, you can't lose your job if you don't pay union dues or fees. It's really simple. This holds union officials accountable. If they start doing crazy stuff, workers vote with their pocketbooks. We just saw this in New York City just the other day. The City University of New York, the union officials there that, quote, represent the professors at that university came out with this radical stand on Palestine and Israel. 50 CUNY professors immediately resigned their union membership and said, we are not paying you for this radical agenda. And the reason they can do that, Todd, is because in 2018, in June of 2018, we won at our National Right to Work Legal Defense Foundation, our sister organization, a case called Janus v. AFSCME. We litigated this case on behalf of a state employee in Illinois. And that state employee said, I don't want to pay dues to a union I disagree with as a condition of working for my government. And so we took that case through the Seventh Circuit all the way to the U.S. Supreme Court. And on that day in June 2018, the U.S. Supreme Court said that no government worker anywhere in America at any level of government could be compelled to pay fees as a condition of their employment. And literally that has had a dramatic impact on public sector unions financially. They haven't caught up with it from an ideological standpoint yet, that they could lose support like these professors in the City University of New York did just yesterday or 2 days ago. But this accountability is what has to be installed back in that union equation, because under the federal law for private sector workers, union officials have the sole voice in the workplace. An individual can't speak to an employer in a unionized environment. The union has to be the sole voice. That doesn't make a whole lot of sense, and it does give union officials dramatic power. In the public sector, that forced representation still exists, but there can no longer be compulsory fees in the government sector.
But I'm sorry to interrupt, but the Janus decision, I'm just concerned about understanding it clearly, because even though it granted what you said it granted, there have been, true to form, the unions have created all kinds of impediments to the law being enforced.
Yeah, absolutely. There's lots of litigation going on there, Todd, and that's a great point. They don't give up easily. This is a really unique privilege they've got. The idea that says, Todd, you can't work unless you pay me, a private organization, for your right to work. It's outrageous, and it's hugely unpopular, but, being right doesn't mean you win on public policy battles. You have to mobilize and organize. And the fact that we can pass a right to work law in Indiana, Michigan, Wisconsin, Kentucky, and West Virginia, all in the last 9 years, should give the folks in Connecticut a little bit of hope that, that pigs do fly. They do fly, I promise you, Todd.
We're talking to Mark Mix. We can't call him doctor, as it turns out, but we can call him Mr. President, the president of the National Right to Work Committee. We will take a quick break and continue the conversation on WTIC.
Because you love Todd so much, we're giving you more. Todd Feinberg, now 2 till 6 on WTIC News Talk 1080.
WTIC, it's Todd Feinberg. Mark Mix is our guest. We're talking unions, one of my favorite topics, because they are probably, in the history of the country, the most insidious election rigging scheme and distortion of the way America is supposed to operate as a capitalist country. And when I say these things, Mark, I often get pushback. Oh, unions created the 40-hour work week. We wouldn't have vacations. We wouldn't have weekends if it wasn't for unions. What is the reality of, or at least the alternative conversation there?
Well, first of all, those are really hollow claims when you go back and look at the history of the country. You know, when unions came to America, Samuel Gompers, who's credited as being the father of the American labor movement, at the end of the 1800s and the beginning of the 1900s, we had unionization, but we had voluntary unionization in this country. There were guilds. There were the hat makers guilds and the window glazers and the cigar wrappers guild. And their idea was to put these people together and basically, kind of create barriers to entry, but be able to improve the lot of those guild members through their control over those people that were doing those tasks. Well, the union officials that were part of that all of a sudden had this idea, well, look, if we could do more of this and we get the federal government to sanction it, that would be a really good business model. And Samuel Gompers, in his final speech to the AFL delegates back in 1924 in El Paso, Texas, said, the workers of America adhere to voluntary institutions. Anything else will destroy what brought together through voluntarism is destroyed by coercion. But yet the delegates of the AFL went to the United States Congress in 1926. They got forced unionism into the Railway Labor Act, and then in 1933, Roosevelt tried to get forced unionism on the entire private sector workforce. It was struck down by the U.S. Supreme Court. He tried again. This time he sent a message over across the street saying, hey, if you don't approve this as constitutional, we're going to add 6 new justices to the court. So the switch in time saved 9. That's where we were, the court. And they've imposed a federal monopoly privilege for union officials across the entire private sector. And from there, union officials grew. It's a dramatic power. And
can you tell us more about that history? I'm curious. What was FDR doing? Did he see the political opportunity only, or was it the fact that he had communists around him, and this is really a communist movement? Can you clarify that history for us?
Well, what we can say is this, is we know that most folks in government and public policy say never let a good crisis go to waste. And what we had then was we had an economic crisis back in the late 1929 to 1933, 1934. We had a Great Depression. And so what happened was the federal government decided to use that emergency to dramatically expand their power. And I think there's some elements of all of that, what you mentioned, Todd, in it. But what happened was they drafted this National Industrial Recovery Act, which was this federal policy over all labor law in the private sector. And the Supreme Court looked at it. They struck it down as unconstitutional under the 10th Amendment, the 9th Amendment. So Roosevelt comes back with basically the same bill in 1935. He sends the message over to the Supreme Court saying, either approve this or we'll go to 15 members of the Supreme Court and I'll get it done that way. In that interregnum, between this switch in time, the labor policy, this new labor policy was ruled constitutional. So from 1937 to 1947, union growth took off exponentially because of this government privilege. In 1947, Congress looked at it and said, we went too far. We've got to reform it. We've got to put some regulations on unions. And so they passed the Taft-Hartley Act, which is one really interesting piece that has Section 14B that says states, if they can, by affirmative action, can repeal the forced unionism that's imposed on them by the federal government. In Connecticut today, Todd, there's no state statute that says private sector workers must pay dues. That's a federal force applied to Connecticut. So it's federal law that forces Connecticut workers into private sector unions. And so that history has come along all the way to the point where today, 27 states have passed right to work laws. We have a Janus decision that protects public sector workers, but there's always work to be done. And to your point about the union political machine, we just released a study last week that shows clearly that union officials spent $1.8 billion on politics. I know $1 billion is not a lot of money anymore, Todd, but they spent $1.8 billion on politics and lobbying according to their own reports. That's one of the biggest players in politics, to your point.
There's plenty of campaigns you can look at where the largest donors are one of those unions, not the whole collection of their spending. And you can see that they have huge political influence. And not a lot of pushback. Again, the Republicans aren't so great at taking on these huge, dangerous forces. And what do you see as the opportunities for messaging that could help us along the way?
Yeah. Well, first of all, the idea of right to work is very simple. The idea of, you can choose whether or not you want to join a union. The whole regressive movement's about choice, allegedly, when it's a narrow issue to their pleasure. They talk about choice all the time.
Sure.
It's a narrow agenda, but when it comes to unionization, force is perfectly acceptable to the masters of our universe here, politically in a public policy sense. The idea of giving workers the choice. I think what will happen eventually, we're going to win this battle. It's going to take time, and we'll bring freedom to Connecticut workers too. We'll get it done, but it is a battle against a very large political force. And in politics, money's not everything, but it sure is something. And that's why union officials have to spend this amount of money. Their privilege is granted by government officials, whether it be in Hartford, Connecticut, or Washington, D.C., or Sacramento, California. They've got to play in politics because it's a privilege they've been granted. And this is a privilege they want to hang on to. It's a great business model if you get it, Todd. If you could force everybody in America to listen to your radio show, you don't even have to get up on time anymore, think about topics. You just get on and mumble and talk or breathe because everyone's forced to listen to you.
Well, can we talk about how to implement that? That's sounding very attractive now.
Of course it is. It is very attractive, and that's why it was attractive to union officials and remains one of their core activities is to maintain this power.
Mark Mix is from the National Right to Work Committee. Can you give us a course of action for people who want to learn more and understand this better? Because it's a wonderful organization that you've got, and it's got a great name to it, and I don't think it's the first time I've known you exist.
Yeah. Well, Todd, we have two organizations. We have a Legal Defense Foundation that does nothing but represent employees whose rights have been violated by forced unionism. Mm-hmm. And that's where an individual can go and say, what are my rights in the workplace, whether it be the public sector or the private sector? And they can find information about that at nrtw.org. We have 21 staff attorneys who do nothing but represent employees at every level of the court system, from local court to the United States Supreme Court. Our foundation has been to the U.S. Supreme Court 18 times on behalf of workers. And as I look over here to the right, there's 21 lawyers, 5 of which who have litigated in front of the U.S. Supreme Court that are ready to take phone calls and answer questions of workers. The National Right to Work Committee follows legislation in all 50 states and in Congress, and we track legislation that either expands union power or helps to reduce power and give power back to employees. So they can find information about the committee at nrtwc.org, and they can go to the little map, and they can click on Connecticut, and they can find out immediately what bills are pending up in your state that we support or oppose. And the ones we support give employees power. The ones we oppose give union officials more power. And unfortunately, the balance in Connecticut is one-sided. I won't tell you what side it's on, but I think you know that.
I'm going to flip a coin and see. Mark Mix, can you keep us posted on anything coming down this way that we should know about, whether on the state level or federal level?
It'd be a privilege, Todd. Glad to do it anytime. Hopefully our folks are keeping you posted. And if you want to talk about it, I'm ready.
Yes, me too, anytime. Mark Mix, it's called the National Right to Work Committee. We appreciate your time. We'll talk to you soon, I hope.
Thank you, Todd. Appreciate it.